There's truly something evil lurking in the woods of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Tonight, we're going to be looking at a handful of eyewitness accounts from this exact area. Stories from tonight's episode are courtesy of NorthAmericanDogmanProject.com. Our very first story is a difficult one for the eyewitness. They had no idea what a cryptid was until their son had told them about his own encounter, just before it had aired. All these years, they had convinced themselves that what they had seen was just a very deformed bear. And just so you guys are aware, this eyewitness was driving that night, and they never drink and drive, so in this case, they are 100% sober. And in fact, they haven't even spoke about their encounter since it had happened, until they told their son. So most evenings, just about an hour or so before dark, some of them enjoy going for deer rides. They had a route that they would always use, and it started out on a rustic road, which was southwest of their current cabin on Long Lake, just south of Danbury, Wisconsin. The route had also taken them through a place that had gone through a wildlife preserve, and then they ended up on a road that goes from Hinckley, Minnesota to Danbury, Wisconsin. The road through the preserve always made him uncomfortable, our eyewitness, because it was a swampy bog on both sides of the road. It was a narrow gravel road, and in order to turn around, you would need to go down a very narrow drive to parking area for hunters. Our eyewitness had only been in one of these parking areas once, and it really creeped them out. They never saw deer on the road, so they typically went fast in the area, and they would always try and avoid the gravel road altogether, but however, they always saw deer just before the preserve and just after. On this evening, it was just our eyewitness's sister-in-law and him that went on a deer ride. This happened roughly 15 or 16 years ago, so there were no cell phones, at least not readily available, although they would sometimes take cameras to take pictures of deer. But this night, they did not have a camera with them. It was a rather hot night, and they had their windows down because of the air conditioner not functioning correctly. They were driving a larger car, a 1998 Cadillac. They had just begun starting down the creepy road when they noticed something black on the road, about a half mile or so ahead of them. They were driving fairly fast, and as they appeared to get closer, they noticed that the coloring of this shape is far too dark gray, and it doesn't really make much sense. It also appeared by the shape to have an elongated muzzle, and it had its back to them. But it was also a little sideways, so they were able to tell, our eyewitness and his sister-in-law, that this thing was eating something in the middle of the road. So they come to a stop, and our eyewitness just keeps his foot on the brake. Now, this animal had a very wide, muscular set of shoulders, and its fur was definitely longer than a bear's. Its ears appeared pointy, like that of a German shepherd, and had stood straight up on top of its head. This animal had hands. It was holding a dead rabbit, our eyewitness believes. And so he's saying to Amy, his sister-in-law, "What is that?" And he thinks he was verbalizing every thought that came into his head because he's totally freaked out looking at this animal. And then the most horrifying thing happens. This thing notices them. It starts to turn its head slowly as in response to the vehicle that's there, and that's when the eyewitness fully turns on his headlights. Because it wasn't quite dark yet, he was driving around with them off. But he wanted to see this thing better for some reason, so it turned and faced the car, and the headlights caught its eyes. Now he could not believe what he was seeing. Its eyes glowed this reddish orange in the headlights, and it completely freaked our eyewitness out. Now to him, this creature seemed completely demonic in nature, and then it stood straight up on its back legs, and as this thing moved, it was jerky, like it was uncomfortable in its own skin. It was no natural smooth movement. The animal sprinted at the car, and it took at least 6 steps, and our eyewitness just guns the car right at it. I mean, they're in a complete panic, completely terrified, but then at the last moment, it turns right, still upright, then drops to all fours. Its legs had this odd bend in them, like backward knees almost. And our eyewitness just screams, "What is that?" And it runs off into the swamp, and our guy gets out of there. Now, they eventually end up stopping on a road to the cabin, and by then it was completely dark. When they had stopped, both him and his sister-in-law, Amy, had just cried, and they could not stop shaking about what had happened. And they're talking about what they had just seen, They both agreed that they would have to tell people they had seen a bear because, to be honest, nobody is ever going to believe them. And they honestly thought it was a deformed bear. But they're now aware that it's not exactly that. What they saw that night, they cannot understand or even begin to explain. It was just plain evil in nature. So wrong, so very wrong. Our next story takes us in the wintertime of 1992, when this eyewitness was only 10 years old. They had always been an insomniac and would often be up in the middle of the night. And this was the case of the night in question. So, our eyewitness was in their bedroom, looking out the window on the ground roof floor of the childhood home. And they had looked across the street, and their eyes landing on something that apparently paralyzed them with fascination, and not quite fear yet. Because leaning against the big tree in the neighbor's yard was a massive gray bipedal dog or wolf with huge muscular arms kind of sniffing the air. And he was just kind of standing there. The image was forever burned into this person's mind. The way the steam of his breath swirled out of his nose as he craned his neck from side to side, and the way the snow had stuck to his gray, bristling fur, and the way his ears had twitched. At first, our eyewitness had told himself that it was just a dog leaning on a tree and that maybe he was seeing things, and he couldn't possibly accept what his brain was forcing him to look at and what his brain was screaming at him. There was this crazy feeling he had. He doesn't know how to explain it, and he still feels this way every time he talks about it. But it deeply, deeply disturbed him, and he swears that it knew that he was watching it, just through the edge of his curtains. He goes on to say that he doesn't know how he knows that, but it's just a feeling. While it never looked directly at him, it had sort of glanced in the direction of the house, but he swears it knew that he was watching it, but claims that it didn't seem to mind. In fact, it seemed to be pleased with the strange mixture of stinking fear, confusion, and denial, and awe that this person, our eyewitness, was experiencing. Again, they don't know how they know, they just do. And what happened next completely dispelled any and all denial of our eyewitness. It sort of swung itself off the tree, and instead of dropping down on all fours, as one would expect of a huge canine, it remained standing on its two legs, slightly hunched, and began to walk through the deep snow in the most unnatural and disturbing way possible. They don't even know how to describe it other than unnatural. It was just so wrong to look at. The way it walked, for some reason, was the most terrifying aspect of this whole experience just for our eyewitness. It kind of just sort of lumbered off behind the houses across the street and out of sight. And this person didn't speak of this encounter for nearly 20 years after it had happened. They had never heard anyone else speak of it locally or in Ironwood, or anywhere else for that matter, and just simply chalked it up to another one of the absolutely insane things they have seen in their life that they may never speak of and makes them question their own sanity. But then, on one evening, while they were listening to Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis, he was talking about the Michigan dogman, and our eyewitness's head almost exploded. They couldn't believe it. Other people had seen and talked about this thing. And so he finally breaks his silence and begins to tell his wife about it. It was sort of an epiphany he had in that moment, and ever since, he no longer keeps his strange experiences to himself anymore and tells everybody who he feels would even be slightly receptive to the idea of the paranormal about them. Because in his mind, he imagined how long he had kept these strange secrets to himself for fear of being seen as a lunatic, and how even though he thought he was probably insane, and wondered how many other people are out there, walking around with similar experiences and similar self-doubt, just waiting for somebody to come along and share the strange tale that allows them to give themselves permission to speak freely and feel validated about the things they have kept locked inside of them for so long. It's shocking how many people, once a story is told like this, have some sort of experience of high strangeness of their own. Our third story of the night takes us to June 2017, where this eyewitness has been seeing something at night when he goes out into his yard. At first, he didn't know what it was, but he could see a large yellow eye shine approximately 3 feet off the ground. And he goes on to state that when he sees this being, he gets a fight or flight feeling. And he tells this being that, "I'm not afraid of you, so don't mess with me." He actually verbalizes this to this being, But his neighbor also saw the being in the dark that same night, and when the eyewitness begins to walk towards this being, it sort of just backs up. And although it sounds heavy, but it didn't growl or anything, it just sort of watched the main eyewitness. Now, he went on to say that he went inside to get his knife, and when he came back out, the being was gone. His neighbor even said that he was walking the Ice Age trail at night and heard heavy breathing trailing him. And his wife, although he couldn't see anything, but he says that he did hear something with long nails walking on the pavement, and it sounded like there was more than one being. He also heard a hyena-type laughter from the being. The neighbor had told him that he then saw 5 sets of eyeshine and 4 pairs of yellow and 1 pair of red. He said that the eyeshine was above his head, and he's 5'11", so the beings had to be at least 6'5" to 7 feet tall. Well, Thursday, it was trash day. The neighbor was taking his trash to the curb at about 2 in the morning before he goes to work and the lights of his truck, and he sees something in front of his truck. He said it looked like a wolf on steroids, just very muscular. He said that the head reached his neighbor's chest when it was on all fours. So we're talking about a massive canine creature that when even on all fours is just hulking huge. It looked like a bodybuilder, and it stared at him and yipped, and the neighbor left then. He said the eyeshine was that yellow amber. That disturbing feeling came back and hit him. Now, a week later, the eyewitness was taking his dogs out of their backyard kennels and bringing them inside the house, and the witness let his bulldog in and then saw 2 eyes shining yellow in his yard. The witness went on to say that the being was now about only 40 feet away from him, and it had huge eyeshine, and so he calmly tells it, "I don't care you are here, but don't mess with my family or my dogs." And then he put his other dog in the house and went in himself. At approximately 3 in the morning, they were awoken by a loud animal noise that sounded like a whistle, scream, and hum all at the same time. It seemed like there was some infrasound involved. About 2 weeks ago, the witness and his neighbor saw the being at about 8:30 p.m., and it was still light outside. His neighbor had built a bonfire, and when they were done, he poured water on it, and it smoked and made noise that must have startled the being who was sitting on all 4 feet in some taller grass some feet away. They didn't see it sitting there until the fire smoked and sizzled, and then the being rose up out of the tall grass on 2 legs. It looked around and then looked directly at them. And he says that it had very large muscles, but a kind of more tapered waist, as though it had no body fat. It looked like it had human shoulders, but just very exaggerated and massive. He said it looked like it had a hump on its back, but he thinks that it was muscle. He said that the quads were so thick, and then from the knees down the legs were skinnier. It had pointed ears and was wolfish looking with a bushy tail, like a wolf, like that it was black. And it had 2 white stripes starting at the ears and running down its chest. It was watching them from the tall grass. And it started running towards the woods, first on 4 legs, and then on 2, and then back on 4. Now, the witness got a spotlight and headed for the trail where this being had headed, because there were other ditches on either side of the trail, and he thought the being could be hiding in the ditch. So he decided to go back. The eyewitness in this story believes that it was not nefarious, but just curious and stalking them. Non-threatening, of course. Story 4 takes us to September of 1999. And first off, they're going to keep their name confidential, so we'll just refer to them as anonymous. And just for the fact that this happened on the Air Force Base, and that they don't know who's exactly reading this stuff, so they just want to keep it as close and contained as possible. So, again, this happened sometime in September of 99, but they forget the exact day. But it was early in the month, and it was between 2 and 3 a.m. Our eyewitness in this story was a security forces airman, working 3rd shift on base patrol. Now, mind you, this is an Air National Guard base that they worked at full time. It's on the north side of Duluth, Minnesota, next to the International Airport. North to northeast is nothing but large, thick wooded areas, forested areas. 3rd shift on the base was pretty boring from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and them full-timers worked a skeleton crew, usually only about 5 or 6 of them at a time on 3rd shift. Our eyewitness was in the patrol truck doing their usual rounds and checking doors and fence lines. Late at night, on the north side of the base was usually creepy enough when patrolling by yourself. I mean, you're next to deep, dark, dense woods, and you're just there by yourself. Anyway, they're on this road driving towards the baseball field when their headlights catch a pair of eyes reflecting back at them. They were almost eye level with them. And he's just sitting there, the eyewitness in his F-150, and around this time, a few of the guys had been seeing this huge buck around the property. I mean, we're talking like a 16-pointer or something around that size. And so our guy was about 80 yards or so when he sees these eyes reflecting back at him. So he's thinking it was this big deer. He's got to see this thing. So he hits the gas and starts speeding toward the field. And this is where it all happened so fast. It's almost hard to explain. There was a little slope behind the baseball field. It sloped down probably about 15 feet into the brush line, and the brush went about 30 feet and then turned into a thick tree line. The brush was probably armpit high to our guy and pretty tough to traverse through, being so thick. As he turns into the baseball field and turned the truck towards the thing, he just caught the rear end of the thing leaping down the slope below the line of sight of the headlights. The thing was no more than about 20 feet ahead of him when it leapt, and all he got to look at was the back end of this thing, and it was huge. The best he can do to describe it is to say that it was a wolf dog-like in nature, and that it had a long tail longer than 2 feet. The hind legs looked exactly like that of a dog, same with the back paws, except the paws were huge. They were bigger than his own hands, for sure. The hair or fur was wavy, but it also appeared to be matted and just thick. The color was kind of blondish or a very light brown. He didn't notice any gray in it, but this all happened within about 2 to 3 seconds, so it was just boom, over with. And he's sitting in his patrol truck for a couple of seconds, confused and thinking, I know what I saw, but it couldn't have been what I saw. So he hops out with his flashlight and M16 rifle, walks to the edge of the slope, and all he hears was the thing running through the woods in front of him, heading in a northwest direction. This thing sounded like a moose charging through the trees. I mean, it made a lot of noise. And that's when he begins to get really scared, thinking, man, if this is some sort of wolf or whatever, which it could be, my M16 isn't going to do a darn thing to this animal. So he jumps back into his patrol truck as fast as he could and heads back to the SF headquarters. Now, he never told any of the other members about this for fear of ridicule or being accused of being crazy. But there's no way he had just simply misidentified this thing. I mean, he's a trained observer, an avid hunter, and has worked with animal rehabilitation with the Minnesota DNR in the past. He knows his animals in the northern woods extremely well. He saw exactly what he saw. And that was the back end of a large wolf dog thing that basically had its eyes level with him while he was in the patrol truck. The back end was definitely much larger than any of the largest deer or black bears he's ever seen. The points he remembers the clearest was the tail and the back paws, as well as the texture and color of the hair and fur. This is his story. He has never told it to anybody in fear of ridicule, and he swears it to be truth. Our last story takes place in 2009. They firmly start off their encounter by claiming that they never used to believe in these kinds of things until, of course, their experience, one that very much disturbed them and has made them change their mind, and not for the better. And no, they were not under the influence of drugs or alcohol or any substance specifically, and they even have better than average eyesight, and the lighting was nearing sunset at the time, but they were still able to see clearly. So anyway, they go on to explain that they live in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, which is in generally west central Minnesota, about an hour's drive from Fargo, North Dakota. Now, their mother-in-law lives out in the country, about 4 miles out of Fergus Falls, and they were staying there while his wife and her mother went shopping in the town. They had called him and asked if he wanted to go to a 7 p.m. movie, so sure, he decides to leave the house at about 6:30 p.m., maybe around 6:45, to go meet them at the theater, which is about 2 miles away from their house on a country road known as the Wendell Road, along the Mustinka River. And they had seen 3 white-tailed deer. 2 of the deer were rather small and probably just yearlings, and a larger doe, who they had assumed was their mother. And of course, them being an avid hunter and lover of wildlife and future wildlife biologist, stopped to take a gander at the deer. They should also mention here that they hunt in the area and have spent their whole life in the Fergus Falls area. The deer were following a small creek bed, which is in fact the Mustinka River. so there were hardly any trees except for one. Maybe because they didn't see it there because of the tree, but they just noticed something crouching behind the tree on their side of the road, looking at the deer, and to his belief, hunting them. It is just sitting there, looking at the deer, taking no notice of our eyewitness, even though they were in their truck no more than 40 yards away, with a clear view, nothing obstructing their vision of it. It had one hand on a tree that it was bracing itself with. And what struck the eyewitness as shocking was the fact that it seemed to be a two-legged being and not a quadruped. Its hands appeared to have opposable thumbs and were rather slender and long and very unlike that of a wolf, because the creature looked as though it had stood upright and looked very canine in nature, that it would be well over 7 feet tall with a protruding muzzle, broad shoulders, and a slender tapered waist, thick muscular thighs, and of course there was snow on the ground and they couldn't see any feet, but he was deep in them. He was also a dark brown in color, so he really stood out against the snow and the scenery, and after several seconds of the eyewitness looking at the creature in shock, the deer took off. And then something amazing happened. It looked right at the eyewitness, as though blaming him for losing its meal, and it just sat there, looking at him and blinking, not moving. Now this scared the crap out of our guy, right? So he hits the gas pedal and he drives off. And it was very dark after the movie, so he didn't much feel like trudging through the 3.5 feet of snow with the possibility of a monster lurking in the area, who is currently looking for a meal that our guy scared off, right? So it's probably pissed. So at about 10 a.m., he went back there and walked down to that same tree. Now under the tree, there was no snow, so there were no tracks that they could visibly see, but leading up to the tree, there were 3 tracks leading in from the grandmother-in-law's field, which was hard black dirt. And if you know what a Minnesota field looks like in the late winter/early spring, you can't make anything out of the dirt. The tracks they did find were only about 6 to 7 inches in length, but they were clearly canine prints, with the exception of 4 toe-looking marks in the snow. So clearly, besides the physical experience they had, they're not really sure what to make of it. So what do you guys think? Is there truly some sort of bipedal canine creature lurking in the Midwest, in states like Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, or is it truly all just a misidentification or a hoax? I would love to know what you guys think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to go ahead and smack that like button, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit the subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on, so that way YouTube will let you know every time I release a great new video. As always, guys, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I will see you guys in the next video.